Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. My name is Dima Zaid Al-Kilani, and this is my colleague, Robert.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Bruckner.
So we'll be talking about the on-premises data gateway today. And it's been about a year since we last seen some of you in the last Insights Summit. So there's a lot of exciting new updates that we're super excited to be sharing with you. And let's get started. So in this session, we will be talking about what is the on-premises data gateway. We're going to go through it quickly since we've been gone over it in multiple sessions, and it's covered really well in our documentation, step by step, the download. Then we're going to talk about using it in Power BI and how can you use it in the different environments you have with the different data sources you have, and share the best practices using the gateway if you have a restricted network, and how you can use it with your RLS data sources, and finally share our gateway roadmap with you. So first of all, show of hands, how many of you is using the gateway today? Okay, this is awesome. So thank you for using the gateway. So we'll go through over a few slides about what is the on-premises data gateway. So the gateway is kind of like a bridge that you download it to be able to access your data sources, your on-prem data sources from your cloud services. Last July, we've announced that we're going beyond Power BI with our, back then, what's called Power BI Enterprise Gateway. So now it's called the On-Premises Data Gateway. And we're excited to share that now the unified gateway works with actually 6 cloud services. So you can download one gateway and you can use it across Power BI, Azure Analysis Services, PowerApps, Microsoft Flow, and Azure Logic Apps. It will help you connect with an encrypted, secure method to your data sources. So starting this week, if you've listened to the keynote and the announcements from yesterday, now you can use the new Power BI embedded with all your assets in Power BI, including the on-premises data gateway. So you can use the data gateway with Power BI embedded, and coming in the next 2 weeks, you can also use it with Azure Analysis Services. So for the last few months, people who's using Azure Analysis Services had to download a special public preview gateway. Now you no longer have to do that, and you can use the same gateway you're using with Power BI with Azure Analysis Services. So more about what is the gateway. It's actually, it is not a general purpose bi-directional VPN that you can use for any application. It's special purpose for your on-prem data sources against the 6 cloud services that we mentioned. You can install it on any domain-joined machine. So this is a requirement from installation that it has to be a domain-joined machine to get it to work against your data sources. You only need to open your outbound ports, so it connects with outbound traffic only, and you do not have to install it on a DMZ. We get that question a lot, but you don't. And you don't have to open your firewall or inbound port traffic. So you only have to open for the outbound traffic, and we'll talk more about the security in a bit. And finally, the gateway enables data and API connectivity against your data sources. So this is orthogonal. Where are you installing Power BI, or where you're consuming your reports? All what the gateway is doing is facilitating and ensuring that you have a secure connection between the cloud service and your data sources. So if you want to consume your reports, the Power BI reports on a mobile phone, it's up to you, but the gateway needs to be installed on your machine to facilitate the connection against your on-prem data sources. Now, the gateway uses an Azure Service Bus relay to communicate between your on-prem data sources and cloud services. You do not have to bring your own infrastructure. We take care of that. So all you need to do is just download the gateway and start consuming it on your cloud data sources. Anyone can download it in your organization. It's a self-service, low friction, as long as you have the privilege to download it on the machine and ensure that you're connected and you have the right ports open. And finally, the gateway is a bridge, but unless your machine is running and connected to your network, the gateway cannot work. So you need to ensure it's always connected, the machine is always running in order to make sure that you can run requests through the gateway. the gateway cannot queue up any requests. Let's say your machine was down for a few hours. You will have to send those requests again or refresh your dashboard in case that machine went offline. So just ensure that your gateway is always up and running in order to do that. Now, from a management perspective, I know we have the personal mode gateway, which we will talk about it in a bit, but the default mode for the on-premises data gateway allows for a centralized management. So as a user or as an IT admin, you can download the gateway once and ensure that you can share it with all your analysts who are trying to use or build reports against your on-prem data sources. So you don't have to worry about every and each one of the company downloading their own gateway and going through the port opening and all the requirements from a security perspective. You can download it once. You can share a security group into the admin list for the gateway. So that will take care of it, and you don't have to worry about adding it multiple times. You can also access the control to the data sources. So the way the gateway works, which we will show briefly in Power BI, that in order to make a connection against the data source, the admin or one of the admins need to add that data source and then share it with more people. So that way you can ensure that gateway is not used with any data source in the company, but it's used within a list that you can control as an IT admin or as someone who has control over those data sources. So the gateway has two modes: the default mode, which we refer to as the on-premises data gateway, or previously known as the enterprise gateway. And then other mode is the personal mode. So the difference between them is basically the usage, how you want to use it, and who wants to use it. So the personal mode is specifically used for one person. You cannot share the gateway with more people, but you can share the report that you build on top of that gateway with more people. But everyone who needs to create a report and use it will have to install their own personal gateway. Versus the on-premises data gateway default mode, you can use it, you can share it with multiple people. As I said, add security group, AAD security group, to the list of users and admins, so you can have it more centralized management there. From a features perspective, there's a difference between the personal mode and enterprise mode. With the personal mode, you can only use it for import and scheduled refresh connections. You cannot use it with a direct query or a live connection. Where the on-premises data gateway default mode, you can actually use it for both. So it's up to the user to say, I want to use it for an import connection or a direct query or live connection in case of SSAS. And the other thing is, the personal mode, since it's up to you, you're downloading it, you're consuming it, you don't need to go an additional step of adding these data sources in a management page, where the default mode or the on-premises data gateway, you need to add those data sources explicitly in the Power BI UI. And finally, services supported. Currently, we only support Power BI for the personal mode. Where for the on-premises data gateway, we are supporting, as I mentioned, the 6 cloud services: Power BI, Flow, Logic Apps, PowerApps, Azure Analysis Services, and Power BI Embedded, which is now part of the Power BI. So now for the personal mode, how many of you are using the Power BI personal gateway? Okay, so pay attention. We have an announcement that we've introduced last week. So we introduced a new gateway that we're referring to as the on-premises data gateway personal mode. So we've added a new set of capabilities. We've enhanced reliability and performance for that gateway, and we've done a lot of enhancements to the experiences you have. So if you've been using the Power BI gateway personal and you've seen this message in your dataset settings, make sure to upgrade your gateway to the latest on-premises data gateway, since all refreshes going through the Power BI gateway personal will stop working after July 31st. So make sure to check out the announcements. We have a dedicated documentation page about this, and the migration is really seamless. We made sure to make it seamless for you, so it's just a matter of downloading the new gateway, and we take care of migrating all your credentials and data sources to the new gateway. So just make sure you update to the gateway, to the new personal mode, to ensure that your refreshes won't be interrupted after July 31st. So quickly going through the gateway configuration. As I mentioned, we've went through it a lot in different sessions, so you can learn more about it in our documentation. In this session, we wanted to focus more on the tips and tricks in using the gateway guidance and more about the roadmap. So if this is a new UI to you, it means you have not updated the gateway since March. So make sure to go and download the latest gateway. We have a monthly release. So we updated the gateway UI in the March release, and we've added a lot of new capabilities there. Some of them already existed, but you needed to go through them through your configuration file. So now the gateway will show up that it's online, and we make the checks to check that we can connect to the Microsoft endpoints like the Azure Service Bus, so you don't have to discover that your gateway cannot communicate once you're in production. So as long as you see this checkbox, it means everything is good, and the gateway runtime should be working fine. We start showing the gateway version number, where if this is not up to date, you will see a message saying there's a new version of the gateway, download it now. So you can ensure, as long as you're not seeing it, it means you're up to date. And finally, the list of services that you can use the gateway with, and the regions. So we've introduced the ability to use the multi-region support, but this is mostly for who's using the gateway for Logic Apps and Azure Analysis Services. Otherwise, do not change the region to ensure it keeps working with Power BI, as we will pick up your default tenant region for Power BI. Under service settings, in case you have to restart the gateway service, you can restart it right from the UI. And the gateway service account, you can, by default, when you download the gateway, it runs under an NT service / PBI EGW service. So sometimes you might run into issues with connecting to the outside network with that account, and sometimes you need to have a domain joined account to run the gateway under. So we've made it really easy to change the account you're running the gateway, the Windows service account that is running the gateway. So you just have to click change account and go through multi-step configuration, and after that, the gateway will restart on its own under your new service account. For diagnostics, if you need any additional logging, we've made it really easy with just a toggle. In case you were running into issues and you want to learn more about how your query is being executed, you can come from this UI, click turn it on, and then you will notice that the logs will have more extensive information. Make sure to turn it off once you're done debugging, since this will be an overhead on the gateway's performance and the amount of logs that it will be logging. So remember to switch it back off once you're done investigating any issues with your data source, but it's there where it's easy to turn on and off. Finally, the gateway logs. You can actually click a button to export all the gateway logs, service and configuration logs into one place. So if you were investigating an issue, you can easily turn the logging, make the gateway run, refresh your report, and then export logs and give the logs in one zip file to whoever is helping you with the runtime, or if you want to keep it for to save it so you can go back to it and understand what has changed. Local network connected, you can check it now. Check it as many times as you want. And finally, the Azure Service Bus connectivity mode. We have the HTTP and we have the TCP mode. So Robert will talk more about it in the next few slides to discuss the difference and what do you need to do differently between the two modes. In Power BI, if you have not used the gateway before, all you need to do once you're done configuring the gateway is, before I go, if you do not have a gateway and would like to install it, you can click on the download button and click on Data Gateway. That will launch the gateway installer and you can download it from here. Now that you've downloaded the gateway, you will have to go to Manage Gateways UI and you will see your gateway there. It's to add a data source to your gateway, you click here and you provide all the information. So here we have an Impala data source, SharePoint data source. So only if you add the data source here, you will be able to use it in your data set and refresh settings. Otherwise, the gateway will not show up in the list. So make sure you have all your data sources added here. Even if it was an online data source, you can add it to whatever it matches from the list. For example, if I want to add my Azure SQL connection that is that I have it along with a different, let's say a SharePoint on-prem, I will add a SQL server, and I'll provide my online Azure SQL URL here. So that way I will see the data in the scheduled refresh settings. Otherwise, I will not be able to see it. So make sure any connection that is going through your data set is added in this list to ensure that you can see it there. So quickly going through how the gateway works. So once you have installed the gateway and configured it, while you're configuring the gateway, we assign a service bus instance to that gateway, a service bus channel to that gateway, so it knows that every time this specific gateway needs to make a request, it will go through that channel. Now, when you provide the credentials, when they will be encrypted on the cloud and will only be decrypted once they go through the gateway on your gateway machine. So we'll talk more about the encryption in the next slide, but only the gateway will be able to decrypt those credentials. So let's say one of the supported cloud services like Power BI kicks off a refresh, or someone opened a report that connects to an on-prem data source. What actually happens is the cloud service, or like we call it data movement service, analyzes the request, and based on what data set is associated to which gateway, we detect which service bus communication channel the request will go through. And then the gateway will be polling for a request from the service bus. And once it has a connection, it will take that pending request. It will decrypt the credential once it's inside your firewall or within your corp network, and sends the query out for execution. And after execution, the gateway encrypts everything again and pushes it out to your cloud service. One thing to mention here, that if you're using PowerApps or Flow, or Logic Apps, the gateway also supports CRUD operations. So this query could be, let's say you want to write to your SQL server, it will go through the same flow as here as if it was just a read operation coming from Power BI. So from a security perspective, when you're configuring the gateway, after you sign in, we ask you for the gateway name and another essential thing, which is the recovery key. So when you ask about a recovery key and you enter the recovery key, make sure to save it somewhere really, really safe, and maybe somewhere not on the same machine where you have the gateway, since in case the machine goes offline and you can't have access to it again, you can actually restore the gateway somewhere else, which we will talk about at the end. But there's another advantage of the recovery key, where we generate both the public and the private keys that we use to encrypt your credentials. So it's symmetric and private key will never leave your gateway machine and will encrypt all the credentials within your network. So when you configure your credentials on the Power BI service, the Cloud Gateway service never knows the decrypted credentials. It actually uses the key to send the encrypted back to the gateway, and it will only get decrypted once it reaches the gateway. Now we're going to quickly talk about connectivity in Power BI. So in Power BI, we have both cloud data sources, on-premises data sources, and both import and direct query connections. So from a list of supported on-premises data sources, we have the full list on our documentation, but to list them out here, we have SQL Server, SSAS, Web, OData, Postgres, and SAP HANA, and the list goes on. I just wanted to call out the two latest data sources we've added, which are Postgres and Impala. We've added in the last month, and Impala was actually added yesterday, so you can start using it as of today in some regions, and most regions will get the full capability tomorrow. So, and we're working on adding 3 more data sources in the next few weeks, which are OLADB, Snowflake, and Spark are coming in the next month or so. And finally, on the roadmap, we will be supporting the third-party extensibility that a lot of you have heard, where you can actually develop your own custom connector with Power BI. So once you have that, you can actually use the gateway to keep those data sources up to date. Now, from how to connect to your data sources, there are 2 modes. There are the import mode and direct query mode. So it's when you're creating your Power BI report, you're asked how do you want to connect to that data source in an import or a direct query. So first of all, not all data sources support direct query. So even before going through this list, you need to decide what, depending on which data source you're using, direct query might not be an option. So if direct query is an option for your data source, for example, in SQL Server, there are multiple things to consider when you want to choose how do you want to connect to it. The first one is refresh frequency. So up until, I guess, last week, the frequency was up to 8 times a day, where you can do a scheduled refresh for everyone. Now, if you move to Power BI Premium, you can actually have the refresh happen every 30 minutes. So that's 48 times a day. If you want to keep your data and ensure it's always up to date and you know that's updated frequently, you can actually go through the list and add a refresh every 30 minutes. And that would be supported for Power BI Premium workspaces. From a direct query live connection, you don't have to worry about that. It's always up to date and you can use it. You can ensure that the data is up to date every time you open the report because we're doing a live connection against your data sources. From a can we go questions at the end? Okay, thank you. Performance, there will be no noticeable delay since your gateway will be getting the information right from the cloud service, where the direct query will be depending how often and how quick your data sources can go through your requests. From a data storage in Power BI, this is something important to consider, that we're actually importing your data into Power BI. So you want to consider that depending how sensitive the data and where do you want it to be stored, where for live query you can actually ensure that it's a live connection, except for some parts of the data where they're kept for optimizing loading the dashboard, and you can actually configure how often that is refreshed. And data size, current limit is 1 gigabyte for compressed per model, where for the direct query there's no limit and you can send as many data you want. From a security perspective, for import data, you can actually create a row-level security rules on the Power BI data set. So you can reuse it from there and you'll have to rewrite them. As long as they're up to date, you should be fine. Where in direct query, this is something Robert will be talking about, where with adding additional single sign-on capability from the gateway perspective for direct query connection. Or if you're using SSAS today, you can actually, we use the effective username to show you the data that you actually have access to, or the custom data. Finally, for data sources, as I mentioned, not all data sources are supported through direct query, where for import mode, every data source that is supported in Power BI, you should be able to do an import data source. So switching to Robert now to talk more about the single sign-on.
Yeah, thank you, Dima. So as you saw in direct query mode, one of the big benefits is that if you have defined your security in the underlying database, for example, SQL Server database analysis services, that row-level security can be lifted into Power BI, such that every query that a user interacts with in Power BI will just execute against the underlying system under the identity of that user, and therefore reflect exactly the permissions that the user has in the system underneath. And so you may be familiar already today with the existing capabilities where if your source is SQL Server analysis services on premises, then we can leverage whatever row-level security definitions you have defined in your analysis services database, and the Power BI dashboards reflect exactly that view of the data. And if the dashboard is shared with other users, each user just sees their view of the data. What we are adding is additional types of data sources in direct query mode. And so what we are releasing later this month is single sign-on over SQL Server databases on premises with direct query. And there's additional sources that are coming. And so you see here Oracle. We're also working on SAP sources, Teradata, Impala. There's several more that are coming over the next months. At the high level, the way this works is, in Power BI, the user is signed in with an Azure AD account, and the user interacts with a dashboard, wants to run, maybe drill into a report, run a certain query. The Power BI service generates the query, passes along with the query information about this is the user that wants to execute this query. That information is passed to the on-premises data gateway, and there is mapping capability of how to map the Azure Active Directory user into an on-premise user. I will cover that in detail in a moment. And then the gateway executes that query on behalf of that original user. So let's dive immediately into a demo. And just to set some context, what I will show you in the demo is I will use 3 different accounts. So I will be signed in as 3 different users. And those users have different permissions, right, and different roles. And so the first user I will show you is the administrator, is the user who sees all the data in the underlying database. So I'm using here a SQL Server on-premises database. And as far as the role-level security permissions are concerned, the first user has all permissions, can see all the data. The second user will have restricted permissions. And the third user will actually have no permissions in the database. So let's dive into the demo and show you that scenario. So to start with, this is my gateway, which has this Kerberos single sign-on capability. I've defined my retail data warehouse source. It is a SQL Server data source. So I'll make this a little bit bigger. So it's a SQL Server data source, and I configure credentials, right? That is familiar to you today. There's a new option here at the bottom, which will become visible once we release this capability later this month. And this new capability at the bottom basically indicates that you want to use single sign-on via Kerberos for direct query for this particular data source, which means that every query that is generated will ultimately run as the user, right? It will try to impersonate that user on premises and execute that user execute the query under that user's identity. So how does this look in practice? So this is a dashboard that I've created so I'm signed in as this first user under, I guess, in this tenant here, so under my name. I have all permissions in the database. Here I'm looking at, this is a data warehouse that captures sales over multiple years. It also looks at returns. And so I'm looking at, okay, returns by product category. And so if I drill into the report, right, I notice that, okay, maybe this computers category stands out, right? I want to do some further analysis on this. I have permissions to all the data, right? So I can ultimately I pinned this initial view to my dashboard, and to start with, I want to share this dashboard with a second user. And so I'll share this with Dima. So I just shared this dashboard here. And so this takes a second for the sharing operation to complete. And I'm signed in here in a second browser under Dima. So you see I'm signed in as Dima. And so if I refresh here, I should see that somebody has shared a new dashboard with me a second ago. Okay, so there's this retail data warehouse dashboard that was shared with me. And so you can see both users look at the same dashboard, but Dima only gets to see the particular view, the subset of the product categories that she has permissions to in the underlying data warehouse. So in this case, the only permission she has is seeing sales for the computers category. She doesn't see sales and returns for any other categories. Now this goes further, right? This is not just on the dashboard itself. When Dima drills into this report, she only sees, right, even when you look at some of these, right, total sales amounts, right, across all transactions that are kept in the data warehouse, she only sees a total sales amount of $3 billion versus, right, myself as the overall, right, administrator or as the super user on the database, right, I see the full $12 billion. Yes, so all the security roles here were defined in the underlying SQL Server database. If I change those security rules, right, all the data in the dashboard immediately reflects that, okay, that the rules are now different. So I didn't have to manage, right, or worry about setting up any separate security rules. It's really whoever owns the database, right, whoever set up the security rules is reflected in whichever way the data is consumed through Power BI. And so this goes further, right? Here, the original user, I have permissions to all the sales transactions. So I want to pin also the total volume of sales to the dashboard. And so on my dashboard, right, I now see ultimately that I had, right, the full product categories and the $12 billion. For Dima, right, she sees there was an update made on that dashboard, but again, all the numbers that show up are in the context of her user account. So she only sees the $3 billion, which is the subset of the data she has permissions to. So now let's say Dima goes ahead and she shares this dashboard, right, with a friend of hers in another department. And so she shares this with Siri. And So she just shared the dashboard, right? Now, as far as the database is concerned, right, Siri shouldn't actually have any permissions, right? As the database administrator, I haven't given any permissions to Siri. So let's see what Siri is going to see, right, when he, right? So he's signed in here. So I'll maximize this browser. So this is Siri, right, signed in into this browser. I'm just refreshing. So there should be a new dashboard showing up. Yeah, the dashboard was shared just now. And so when Siri opens it, basically he sees, OK, yes, there's a dashboard, but he doesn't get to see any data. And that is because, as far as the underlying configuration is concerned, I'm actually denying that user access to the database. So if I change that and give access to Siri and give him a certain view of the data, then yes, his dashboard will update. But same thing, if he had access and I revoke access, OK, his dashboard will basically reflect that state, that Siri doesn't have permissions to see any data anymore. So this is really completely transparent from a security perspective. So just to recap, right? As the first user, I created a dashboard against my corporate data warehouse, right? I have certain security permissions set up in that data warehouse. I don't have to worry as the author of that report, or even as an administrator, I don't have to worry about users seeing data they shouldn't see. With this new capability, of single sign-on, the gateway can seamlessly run those queries, all the queries in Power BI, the dashboards, the reports, the interactions that users perform, seamlessly run them against the on-premises data source, and those queries reflect exactly the permissions of that user. So in a little bit more detail, what you saw in the demo was kind of the same principle. Every query that runs in Power BI is generated, and along with the actual query, it adds information about who is the user who wants to execute this query. And so this is passed to the on-premises data gateway. And there's a new capability in this gateway that you can configure it for single sign-on in this on-premises environment to begin with Kerberos. And so what it does is, and we will get into this in a moment, depending on how you have set up your Azure Active Directory, if it's synchronized, then it will automatically map it to the local user. If you didn't synchronize your Azure Active Directory, the gateway can still map that Azure incoming Power BI user to a local domain user, and then, given the Kerberos configuration, ultimately execute that query on behalf of that user, and so against multiple of these data sources. And so let's talk about that user mapping. And so you may be familiar with the user mapping if you use the gateway with analysis services on premises today. You may have seen there's multiple options of how to get this per user security working with analysis services. The first option is, and that is kind of the easiest one, if you have already your Active Directory synchronized with Azure Active Directory, then yeah, you don't have to do further steps in terms of doing additional configuration steps on the gateway. Now, for some companies, due to mergers, acquisitions, or other complex on-premises Active Directory forest structures and so on, it may not be possible for you to synchronize your Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. So we had this option in the past where specifically for analysis services, you could manually configure mappings of users. And I have included here the link to the documentation, and so we can quickly bring this up. There's a video that explains it, but in the end, you can ultimately define either individual accounts of how you remap them from your Azure Active Directory to on-premises, or you can also do wildcard kind of replacement rules. But in the end, if you have to do this for too many of these accounts, then it becomes really not manageable, to do this manual mapping. And so what we have introduced is also the ability of the gateway to look up the mapping in your local Active Directory, which means that the gateway receives a UPN, a user principal name, from Azure Active Directory, and you configure, as part of the gateway configuration settings, you configure, OK, it should query the local Active Directory in your environment, look up that particular Azure user principal name, and see what account it matches in the local Active Directory. And there's configuration properties because, right, there's no standard way necessarily. So you can configure, okay, what is the specific attribute name on your person object in Active Directory that you want to perform this lookup and match against. And the lookup would then return back a person object. And you can also configure, okay, which of the attributes of that person object you want to use as the actual local account name. And so that way, you don't have to manually manage these mappings, right, somewhere on the data source configuration. Rather, you just do this as part of your Active Directory user management. You configure this centrally in Active Directory. The gateway can look up these settings at runtime. And if you make changes, add new accounts, or you make updates to existing accounts, those things would take effect immediately. So again, you would only need this if you cannot synchronize your local Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. This particular option that we don't have, right? You saw Dima showing you the new configurator UI experience. So we don't have that configuration yet in the actual UI. So you have to go to a config file. But it's pretty straightforward, and we will document basically how to do this. It's 2 configuration settings in a config file. So how does this look in practice in terms of step-by-step? If you have configured this property lookup, right, from a cloud service perspective, right, it's still the same thing. The Power BI service generates a query, attaches the information of the original Azure Active Directory user, right, the Power BI user who wants to execute this query. The on-premises gateway, if it has configured that lookup, what it does is, first of all, it will find the Active Directory endpoint to query. And it has an automatic detection, which generally works in most Active Directory environments. So you don't actually have to configure the endpoint. But if you have a really complex environment, there's a third configuration option where you can even indicate which of your specific domain controllers should be queried. Then it will basically run a lookup query, an Active Directory lookup query for the particular user principal name that was coming from Power BI who wants to execute a query. It will, if the lookup succeeds, right, it gets back basically the information about that person in the local Active Directory, and get also the local username, right, in the Active Directory, which may actually be, right, as you can see here, not only the domain name may be different in your local Active Directory, you may even have, right, in your Azure Active Directory, maybe you configure things as first name dot last name, whereas in your local Active Directory, you may have some person alias, right? So ultimately, this allows the gateway to perform this lookup and remap the user to a local Active Directory user, and then run the query along with that user information. And then the data source, whether this is analysis services, right, on premises, or this is SQL Server, right, and you use the right query with single sign-on, it will basically then execute those queries as that identity. This does require a Kerberos configuration, and there will be detailed step-by-step configuration information on how you configure specifically the SPNs, the service principal names, as well as the Kerberos constraint delegation between the gateway and the particular database that you want to enable this with. So maybe a show of hand, anyone in the room is using Kerberos today in your environment? Okay. So some of you are using Kerberos, so this may be something interesting for you to look at. I think for companies who have experience with Kerberos, the instructions should be pretty straightforward, shouldn't be surprises in there of what you have to do there. But we will also have documentation even for ones who have never tried Kerberos, information about what Kerberos is about, and how to leverage this for the single sign-on experience. All right, so let's go into a few additional settings and troubleshooting aspects that I would like to go through. So first of all, where to install the gateway. And so our recommendation is that generally you want to start with an 8-core machine. Yes, you can start smaller, and we have also this experience where you can install a gateway in one machine and then take over its settings on a different machine. So even if you started on a machine that was maybe too small, you can just run through the setup experience and say, I want to take over the settings of an existing gateway and just install it on a different machine, take over all settings, and then that way you can also today kind of scale up if you like. The gateway itself doesn't have to run on the same machine as the particular data source, right? It just needs to have line of sight from a network perspective. And the hardware needs really depend on your usage scenarios. There is another session at the Data Insight Summit that goes deeper into performance, right? performance considerations, how to optimize performance. At the high level, right, I've only here when you use data model refreshes, those tend to be more heavy on the gateway because when it performs, it pushes down the queries and performs the queries as close to the data source as it can. But if the data source doesn't have certain capabilities, the engine that we run inside the gateway compensates for it, does filtering, sorting, aggregation, and so on, so that only the finally processed data is ultimately refreshed into the cloud service. With direct query, that's more of a pass-through scenario. But with direct query, you tend to have high frequency of queries because every user interaction in the service, especially if RLS, every user runs their own queries. So if you have lots of concurrent users, it can also lead to higher load on the gateway. On the network settings, so Dima showed this already in the configurator. There is the option, we introduced this in the February release, to basically run explicitly in the HTTPS mode. So by default, the gateway will run in the TCP and auto-detect mode. But depending on what proxy manufacturer you're running, what proxy hardware you're running in your network, and you may have locked down also TCP communication, so you may have to switch to HTTPS explicitly. So there's now an easy UI configuration button to just switch it over to HTTPS. From a performance perspective, generally, you will probably not notice much of a difference. So the HTTPS transport is almost as fast as TCP. And so in general, in practice, we have not found too much difference, although technically TCP is a little bit faster. The benefit of switching it to HTTPS mode is also that what we have combined here is that all the communication from the gateway to Azure, Service Bus, and the cloud doesn't go to a set of IP addresses, but it actually goes to a set of named machines that all are within the servicebus.windows.net namespace. So that can also help you if in your proxy server you need to set up, I guess, rules that restrict the communication to certain subdomains, instead of opening up for IP addresses. Finally, on the gateway logs, you may have seen in the configurator, there's a button that you can just export the logs. So you don't have to necessarily look for them in the file system. It just wraps everything up and exports them as a package. Couple of thoughts on disaster recovery and gateway restore. So as Dima said, when you set up the gateway, yes, make sure you save off the recovery key, keep it in a safe place. It's also a good idea to add, as a gateway administrator, you add a security group. So you have multiple members of a security group who can administer that gateway. When you use that gateway restore scenario, you basically just install a gateway on a new machine. You go into and set up in that experience, say, restore, take over an existing gateway. You need to sign in, You can only take over gateways that you are an administrator of, and you have to know the recovery key. Otherwise, we will not allow you to take over the settings of an existing gateway. But once you did that, all the data source settings move over, and that usually is a quick process, can take 1-2 minutes or so, depending on how many data sources and settings you have. And from that point on, the restore gateway has the same name, immediately takes the place of the original gateway. Maybe you lost the original gateway due to a hard disk crash, so it's not recoverable. The machine is maybe not recoverable. So you don't need to worry about doing any further operations. It's the takeover scenario that immediately takes the place of the original gateway. Now that leads to the topic of high availability and load balancing. Today, there is this manual takeover scenario, which kind of is an availability scenario, which switches traffic from one gateway to another gateway. You can also do manual workload partitioning, meaning that you can define the same data source on multiple gateways, and then for each data set in Power BI, you can decide which gateway out of the many gateways that you may have as an option, which gateway to use for that particular data source. So you can kind of manually partition the traffic, but there is no automatic load balancing, automatic failover available today. That said, it's something that we are working on, and it's something that is coming to Power BI over the next months. And the way to think about this is, you can basically now say, when you install a gateway, you can join a cluster of gateways. And when a gateway joins a cluster of gateways, the cluster really acts as a single logical unit Right? And this is not a heavyweight Windows clustering concept or so. This is really more of a very lightweight concept where you just say, yeah, I have this existing gateway and I install a new gateway on this other machine. And instead of installing a complete standalone gateway, I just say, hey, I would like to have this new gateway act as a logical unit with this gateway on this other machine. And so once you do that, you will basically get high availability across those gateways. And then also we will add load balancing across that unit of gateways. A few more tips. And so you saw in the configurator, if you run an outdated version of a gateway, right, and you launch the configurator, it actually shows you right here in the UI that, hey, you're running an outdated version, and here's the download link to update to the latest version. Of course, as Dima said, right, the gateway, keep it always on, and ultimately, right, keep the credentials up to date. It can be, a gateway can be installed on Windows Server as well as client operating system. It cannot be installed on a domain controller, which, just calling it out, but usually, yeah, you don't want to run this on a domain controller. You can also install this gateway on the same machine as the Azure Data Factory gateway. And in terms of the outbound communication, we touched on this, right? There is the HTTPS mode, which would then only use HTTPS communication. By default, it would try to use TCP communication because it has slightly better performance. Here's just a link that I want to show. There's more information on this link to really find FAQs as well as troubleshooting information. Finally, I want to spend a moment on the roadmap. And so what you will see is that for Impala, right, you can use it already as of today. For import, we're also adding direct query capabilities, and those will roll out over the next few days. So this is basically part of the June release. We are also rolling out single sign-on with Kerberos for SQL Server database direct query to start with. This is coming towards the end of June. That said, there's additional types of data sources that we're working on. Some of them are in private preview right now. Some of them, okay, we are starting to work on. As an example, you can see the Oracle, Teradata, SAP BW. We also work on SAP HANA, Impala. So those are things that you can expect to see over the coming months. In the July release, you will see we add Snowflake direct query and import through the gateway. We also add OAuth support so that you can actually run mashups from cloud sources and on-premise sources through a gateway. And then high availability, expect to see a preview in the next quarter. Automatic load balancing also coming later this year. And then, yeah, as I said, SAP BW is one of the sources that we're also ultimately looking at single sign-on, not just regular direct query, but also single sign-on. And then finally, the third-party extensibility that you can implement your own custom connector and use it with the gateway. So that's also something that we are working towards. With that, I think just a quick summary. We went through, okay, what is the on-premises data gateway? We went through usage scenarios in Power BI. We showed some of the new experiences that we're releasing around single sign-on, some troubleshooting aspects, and the roadmap. With that, would like to open it up to Q&A. You can use the microphone up here. And I think the gentleman back there has been waiting patiently, so thank you very much. But we'll also be around afterwards. Yes, please go ahead. So the question was, is for the import cached scenario, is it always a full query? So today it is a full query. The incremental update aspect is something that is on our roadmap that we will also support this in future. Okay? Yes?
Is there like any kind of time frame for that?
So for the incremental update, the time frame for this is that we are starting work, I guess, we look at this right half-year cycles in terms of the second half of this year. So we are doing work in the second half of this year. In terms of when exactly we release, I think it's too early to give you a precise month or so on that.
But just knowing it's in process is really good news. Thanks.
Yeah. I think the gentleman here.
Thanks. Congratulations on all of these features. The load balancing thing is great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I noticed that for the single sign-on, you guys work closely on the SQL Server side to integrate that security.
Yes.
So I'm curious, in terms of SSAS, right now we have row level security. Any plans on allowing column security?
Column security in the sense, so today you could accomplish column security in SSAS as well with using, you can define your own custom rules. Are you looking for something that is, I guess, a different management concept?
Yeah, something that's more in line with perspectives. Right now you can show perspectives with columns, but not really use it as a security feature.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. So perspectives, yes, it's more like a view concept.
Yeah.
So it restricts how much of the data model you see.
Yeah.
It's not a security concept.
Yes.
So that one, I don't think there's immediate short-term plans to enhance perspectives.
Can you use custom data for that? Or?
There is, yes, there's also the mechanism of custom data in analysis services where you could write your security rules such that the custom data basically passes along, for example, use information, and that would restrict, but it would still, I think as far as the data model view is concerned, you would still see all tables, right?
Yeah.
So it sounds like you also want to restrict what tables, what columns are visible. So yeah, short term, I think there's no changes planned in analysis services for that part.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. So we will still be around for additional questions.
Thanks.
Thank you.